Young Americans for Freedom chapter. If you're unfamiliar with Young Americans for Freedom, we're the premier student activist organization in the conservative movement. We work hard to educate our fellow Spartans on America's founding principles, things like individual freedom, free enterprise, a strong national defense, and the traditional American values that made our country so wonderful. Our chapter hopes that you all enjoy tonight. If any students in the audience would like to see more events like this carried out at Michigan State, or if you just want to stay up to date with our plans for this school year, remember to sign up for our newsletter at the table near the entrance. Tonight, I want to thank all those who helped make this lecture event possible. I would like to give a special thanks to Randall and Jane Rogers, whose generous support is helping students at Michigan State University and across the state altogether understand Ronald Reagan's legacy, conservatism, and America's founding principles. I would also like to thank my friends and family, Young America's Foundation, for their support, as well as my executive officers who labored day and night to ensure that this event could be possible. But most importantly, I'd like to thank our Michigan State police officers for ensuring that Spartans remain safe on this campus every single day of the school year. They do a terrific job, and I ask that you now join me in thanking them. So now, without further delay, it is my honor to introduce our guest tonight. Dinesh D'Souza has had a 25-year career as a writer, scholar, and public intellectual. A former policy analyst in the Reagan White House, D'Souza also served as the John M. Olin Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the Robert Karen Wishwain Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Born in Bombay, India, and educated at Dartmouth College, he has been described as a man who can bridge cultures, a man who understands history and scholarship, politics, theology, and philosophy. He has also been described as a truly influential conservative speaker. As an author and filmmaker, he has written several New York Times best-selling books and directed multiple documentaries. His most recent film, Death of a Nation, explores the role of the Democratic Party in opposing both the presidencies of Abraham Lincoln and Donald Trump. Death of a Nation is available now on DVD, Blu-ray, and digital HD. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. This is fantastic. Glad to be here. Thanks to Young America's Foundation for putting this together. Very pleased to be here with my wife, Debbie. Want to say hi? So we're both immigrants to America. Debbie from Venezuela, I from India, and this is significant because I think to some degree we bring to the discussion of American politics and American history what can be called the immigrant perspective. And the immigrant perspective is different than the perspective of somebody born in this country. One reason for that is that if you're born in this country, everything in America seems normal. It's very difficult to separate what makes America unique because this is the only America you know. But the immigrant doesn't see it that way. You know, a few years ago, I was at Stanford University. I did a debate with Reverend Jesse Jackson, and we were debating, is America a racist society? And it was a very interesting debate. I said to him something like, well, Reverend Jackson, this is a big country, and I'm sure one can find examples of racism. But where's the racism today that's keeping you back, or me back, or your children or mine from achieving the American dream? Where's that kind of racism? Show it to me. And he let off a few big one-liners. You know, I may be well-dressed, but I'm still oppressed, and this sort of thing. But essentially, he answered that he couldn't, but that was no undermining of his argument. He goes, the racism today has gone underground. It's covert. It's not overt. And so the less evidence there is for it, the more we have to be scared of it because it doesn't show its ugly face. Now, I think what the reason I mention this is not to refute him, but to say as I'm listening to him talk, it occurred to me, wow.
Get the fuck out of MSU.
Yeah. All right. All right. Uh-oh. We have a critic. Oh. All right, let me keep going. All right. All right. You'll have your chance, my friend. All right. Okay. You know what? I think it's a real reflection of the... See, this is the acceptable bigotry of the left. This is the acceptable bigotry of the left in which... You have this lousy beneficiary of white privilege, right? Now, if he knew an ounce of history, he would sit here, listen to me, and stand up and ask a question that will show me up. But he won't do that. He won't do that because he's a thug. He's a thug who wants to shout me down. That's all he knows how to do. Listen, you don't have the right to tell these people what they can hear. They all came voluntarily. So why don't you sit your butt down and listen to me and then ask a question? It's not your school. It's not your school. Did you start it? Did you pay for this building? You're probably... All right. All right. Yeah, let me have my say. Ma'am? Hold on. May I call in security? Ma'am, he's not letting me continue my speech. What's the policy of the university? He's shouting me down and not letting me speak. Oh boy. Well, let's continue. This is actually my topic for today, the breakdown of civility in America. Part of what I was trying to say a moment ago was that in debating Jesse Jackson, I was sitting back and thinking to myself, it's really odd because here we are, two guys, and frankly, if you hold our hands up, we're about the same skin color. We're talking about the same America that we both live in. And how is it possible for two people to see the same thing so differently? We saw this in other cases. Look at the Kavanaugh hearings. Same set of facts available to everybody, and yet two groups of people see the same facts totally differently. Now, part of the reason for this, I believe, in my debate with Jackson was that I was bringing the immigrant perspective and he was bringing the perspective of someone born and raised in this country. So someone born and raised in this country is going to judge America by what can be called the utopian standard. America measured against its own ideals. America measured against perfection. America measured against the Garden of Eden. The immigrant never does that. The immigrant's always going to compare America to some other existing country. So one may say that the immigrant is using a comparative or historical standard, not a utopian standard. And that brings a different kind of analysis compared to what? Now, I want to talk about what's happening in American politics today. Ever since Trump's election, I think you know, we actually haven't had anything resembling a legitimate policy debate, a debate about principles or ideas. The air has actually been thick with two accusations: racism and fascism. And these two accusations, made often against Trump, often against the right, against conservatives, but behind them is a whole kind of progressive historiography, because it would make no sense, for example, to say Trump is a fascist if behind it there wasn't a deeper assumption: fascism is on the right. If fascism were not on the right, it would make no sense to say Trump is a fascist. And yet the notion that fascism is on the right long predates Trump. The notion that fascism is on the right goes back to World War II. It's an old idea. So what I'd like to do is I want to zoom in and say a word about racism, and then I want to say a word about fascism. And in both cases, I'm actually trying to challenge what I'm going to call fake history. Fake history. We're used to hearing about fake news, but I'm talking not just about a news story, but the story behind the story, the meta-narrative, the big story. And I want to begin, I'll say a few words about race, and I'm going to turn to fascism. I want to look not just at history, but where is the racism and fascism, if there is any, now? Where is it in American politics today? That's really where I want to go. So let's start with racism. Racism, of course, in America developed out of the slave plantation. It became an ideology sustained by the practice of widespread domestic slavery. Very often, this racism is pinned on the American founders. But of course, slavery in America began 150 years before the founders. The first slaves came to America around 1619. Slavery had been in America 150 years before Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. And therefore, when Jefferson says things that seem to us now odd, he goes that the abolition of slavery is the great object of desire of these colonies. All the colonies, the North and the South. This is Jefferson. And to understand what he's talking about, he's blaming the British for introducing and institutionalizing slavery in America against the will of the American people, North and South. The plantation system that we today identify with slavery did not exist in a mass form in the founding. In fact, it took Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 after the founding for the whole ideology of cotton is king to take hold. And the vast network of plantations that dotted the American South developed very strongly between 1793 and the 1830s. That developed in the 1820s a new political party, the Democratic Party, which became the defender and the protector of the slave plantation. And in fact, the apologies for slavery that we see in the 19th century, there's no echo of that in the American founding at all. Jefferson, who owned slaves, will say things like, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. The Almighty has no attribute that will take our side in this contest." This kind of moral condemnation of slavery that you find in the founding disappears from America in the 19th century, and the Democratic Party becomes the explicit defender of slavery. Abraham Lincoln, by the way, knew this. And Abraham Lincoln knew that the problem was not with the South. The problem was with the Democratic Party in the North and the South, which worked together to protect slavery. When Lincoln named what he called the four bad guys of slavery, he named them. Three of them were Northern Democrats. Only one, Roger Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision, was a Southerner. I mean, he was from Maryland. But the other three, Franklin Pierce, the former president from New Hampshire, James Buchanan, the sitting president from Pennsylvania, and Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's famous rival from Illinois, notice that they're all Northern Democrats. This is very important today because when Antifa types like the kid we saw here knocking down Confederate statues, that game is aimed at pinning the blame of slavery entirely on the South. There's a big statue of Franklin Pierce. There's a huge statue and monument to Stephen Douglas in Chicago, completely untouched. Why? Because progressive historiography has to hide the complicity of the Northern Democrats in protecting slavery. You got to pretend like it was all Robert E. Lee, even though Robert E. Lee opposed slavery and opposed secession and only went to fight because he thought he had to defend his home state and his own family. Now, this is slavery. But of course, the thrust of the progressive argument today is that we don't have to worry about all that because in those days, Abraham Lincoln was actually a liberal. Abraham Lincoln was actually a progressive. He would have been a Democrat today. And in fact, the two parties have kind of switched sides. And this is actually worth considering for a moment. First of all, Abraham Lincoln never called himself a liberal. Nor did he ever call himself a progressive, a term that actually came into currency only in the late 19th and early 20th century. The term that Abraham Lincoln used to describe himself repeatedly was, yes, conservative. Because Lincoln said, "I'm conserving the principles of the American founding." Lincoln saw himself as defending the anti-slavery principles of the founding. And when Lincoln defined slavery, he defined it this way: you work, I eat. So for Lincoln, the key to slavery isn't even the racial aspect, that's there, but the key to it is theft. One guy works, and the other guy takes the fruit of his labor. And Lincoln says that this is the operating principle, not of the South, but of the Democratic Party. And against it, Lincoln posits the principle of what he calls the Republican Party, which he describes this way: the hand that makes the corn has the right to put the corn into its own mouth. In other words, people have a right to keep the fruits of their labor. And this is Lincoln's view of social justice. Social justice is, I keep what I earn, and you keep what you earn. And the brain surgeon has no more right to take the wages of the street sweeper than the street sweeper has the right to take the wages of the brain surgeon. Both those things would amount to theft. And very interestingly, when we say this, and I mentioned this is now from more than 150 years ago, we see the resonance of these principles even today. What does the Republican Party stand for now, if not the fact that people have the right to keep their stuff? And what does the Democratic Party stand for now? The party has changed, a lot of things are different, but its core principle is still the same. You work, I eat. You work, they can confiscate the fruits of your labor, and they get to decide what to do with that. I mentioned this to show that the parties have changed, but they've also, certain things also remain the same. There's continuity in history, no less than discontinuity. Did the parties swap sides? We hear that the racist Dixiecrats, who were seduced by Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, became Republicans. Both in my book and my movie, I put up a list of all the racist Dixiecrats on the screen. There's well over 100 of them, both in the House and the Senate. And then I start to count. How many of those racist Dixiecrats became Republicans? And the correct answer is precisely two. Two. One in the House, Watson, Albert Watson, and one in the Senate, Strom Thurmond. And all the other racist Dixiecrats lived and stayed and died in the Democratic Party. And many of them lionized as Democrats. Debbie and I were in Washington, D.C. recently. There are buildings in Washington named after them. So the notion that the racist Dixiecrats became Republicans is an empirical falsehood. And in fact, the whole notion that Nixon did this is completely preposterous for the simple reason that when Nixon became president, the first thing he did was he implemented America's first affirmative action program. It was called the Philadelphia Plan, implemented in 1969, the first legal program in United States history to give legal preferences to non-whites or blacks over whites. So think about it. If you have a racist candidate trying to court a racist base, does it make any sense to implement a preferential program that favors blacks over whites? This makes absolutely no sense. So the whole notion of Nixon's Southern strategy is bogus, fake history. Now, when I say these things, I have to pause because I say to myself, I realize I'm actually running against a point of view that has been drummed into you and into a lot of Americans for a long time by a lot of people. And I have to raise the question of how is it that you, smart guys at a smart university, how do you get to know things that are actually false? The answer is that your education is built on what can be called progressive historiography. And what I mean by that is that the progressives who came to power in the 50s and 60s, almost a generation ago, they wrote the history books. And they wrote books that said fascism is on the right, and their colleagues who were like-minded cheered them, and the New York Review of Books published favorable reviews, and NPR did interviews with the authors, and then Michael Moore came rolling in to make a documentary, or Steven Spielberg gave the point of view a cameo in a movie, and then the guys at Wikipedia got a hold of it. So here you are, smart guy, and you say, wow, fascism has to be on the right because there it is in Barnes & Noble, and there it is on the History Channel, and there it is on Wikipedia, and I heard something on NPR. So the fact, even though it's the same bullet that is ricocheting from one wall to another, you get it from all different directions, and you think, wow, it's got to be true, even though you weren't there. Now, very interestingly, the progressives who said these things and wrote these books, they were there. They actually knew better. But they also knew that when American troops went into the gas chambers and American troops liberated those starving, emaciated, ghostly figures and pulled them out, and the whole world saw these images of fascism and Nazism, they knew that fascism and Nazism are permanently discredited. And they figured that if young people in the future, like you, ever figured out that fascism and Nazism were not only on the left, but were in bed with the left, then the whole game would be over. The Democratic Party would be finished. You might say, what do you mean finished? Well, the Whig Party used to be a party in America, and it went away. It collapsed, it disappeared. It was unviable. The Democratic Party, in 2 or 3 key moments of its history, has faced existential danger. And one of them was right after World War II. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation. I'm going to pivot for a moment into fascism. Because in order to understand fascism, notice it's a word that we use all the time. Like you just have to turn on like MSNBC. There's Rachel Maddow, Chris Matthews. Fascism. But you don't get the sense that if you said, define it, they could. Or their definitions would be so all over the place that you'd have trouble grasping what fascism even is. Now, we have to be careful here because when we think of fascism now, we automatically think of the gas chambers and the Holocaust. And that's fascism circa 1945. But that's not how Mussolini became a powerful figure in Italy in the 20s. And that's not how the Nazi Party was the largest political party in Germany in the 30s. Fascism was a political movement that campaigned. It had an ideology. It had a philosophy. I want to say a word about that. Fascism grew out of the crisis of Marxism. And what I mean by this is that the Marxists had predicted in the 19th century that because of this clash between the bourgeois and the working class, there would be revolutions exploding all over Europe. And these revolutions never happened. And so when the 20th century came along, the Marxists were embarrassed. They were like, the prophecies of Marx are not proving to be true. Why is that? What did Marx get wrong? Ultimately, Mussolini decided that what Marx got wrong is that for Marx, the sole dividing line was class. Whereas, as Mussolini saw it, people are not so much attached to their class as they are attached to their country. Mussolini saw that in World War I, the German socialists fought for Germany, and the French socialists fought for France. And so Mussolini said, there's only one kind of socialism that will work in the future. It is National Socialism. It is socialism that marries people's deep attachment to their country with socialist, left-wing, redistributionist, welfare state ideals. And that is where Hitler got the idea that his party should be called the National Socialist Party. Because it was an attempt to rescue Marxism from its historical failure by engrafting onto it the new idea of nationalism. Now, all the leading fascist parties in Europe, there were fascist parties in Britain, in France, in Belgium, in Italy, in Germany. Every single founder of modern fascism was a man of the left. There is no exception to this rule. And the core idea of fascism was really simple: government control of the private economy and government control of the lives of the citizens. That's the idea of it. That's what it's about. Mussolini put it beautifully: everything in the state and nothing outside the state. The state ultimately runs the economy. The state runs your life. Now, this does not sound like Trump. This, in fact, is chillingly similar to the ideology of the left. The ideology that says, number one, the government regulates the private economy. This isn't a government takeover of the private economy. The government's just telling the private industry what to do. Obamacare. You have private hospitals, you have private healthcare, private insurance, but who sets prices? Who says what can be covered? Who tells these people what to do? Government control of the economy. And the second thing, government control of your lives, which is to say, not simply how you act, but more critically, how you think. So when Debbie and I were in Nuremberg and Munich shooting this movie, and very interesting to watch footage of early Nazism, because you see German families flying the swastika flag off their balcony, and you see them doing the Heil Hitler salute. And I thought to myself, very interesting, why are they doing that? I mean, Heil Hitler, Hitler's not there. Why are you Heil Hitlering? What are you trying to say? And then I realized what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is not, I'm an enthusiastic Nazi, but I am a cowardly worm that doesn't want to go against the state. I am an obedient scoundrel that you can tell me what to do, whether it is to salute or march or go to war or kill Jews. I'm ready to do it because I'm not willing to oppose the prevailing ideology. And this is what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, which is basically mobilizing the whole society in lockstep with its ideology. And intimidating, bullying, and threatening people, sounds a little familiar, who march out of lockstep. Because ultimately, the aggression of the fascist left is always that they're never content until they have the whole thing. Think about the left in this country today. They have the media. They have academia, for the most part. They have Hollywood. They have Broadway. They have the music industry. They have almost all the comedians. You think that would be enough? No. They want the NFL. A bunch of guys running with a ball. They want the NFL. They want the Boy Scouts. They pretty much got the Boy Scouts. They want the Christian baker. You got to bake a cake. Even if he goes to the Supreme Court and wins, that's okay. Sue him again. Destroy his life. Why? It's not about him. It's showing all the other worms out there that you better not threaten the ideology that we are, or we'll go get you too. In other words, at the end of the day, there's a certain habit of mind that is not content until all of us fly the swastika flag off our balcony. And that's a way of saying we give in. We succumb to the prevailing ideology of the state. Now, that is actually fascism. It's also fascism to use the weapons of the state against your opponents, a situation with which I have a little bit of depressing familiarity. Well, to be honest, it is possible to encounter the state even if you've done something wrong and see it in its full power. In my case, I exceeded the campaign finance law. I was overenthusiastic in trying to help a friend of mine. I just kept giving her money, and I exceeded the campaign finance law by $20,000. But the candidate didn't know, to no benefit to me. I got nothing out of it. She was sure to lose. She happened to be a classmate of mine. So the government comes to me, this is the Holder Justice Department, and they basically say, did you exceed the campaign finance law? I say, yes, I did, and I should receive the same penalty as anybody else who did the same thing. And that's when the game gets interesting, because they say, not so fast. They say, we're going to get you for bank fraud. And I say, bank fraud? And they say, well, yeah, because you took your money out of your bank account. I go, whoa. They go, we're going to get you for mail fraud. I say, mail fraud? They go, yeah, because you put your check in the mail. I'm like, wow. And then I realize what's going on. They're taking the same thing I did. They're re-describing it 7 different ways. They are drawing on the federal accordion-like statutes, many of which were put into place to get the mafia or get ISIS, ways of getting Al Capone on a technicality if you couldn't get him for murder. And they're using those against their political opponents to try to get them. And it was very clear to me that if those guys, by which I mean the Obama administration, could have locked me up for 10 years for doing what I did, they would have been delighted to do it. That was their goal. Their goal was, Dinesh is not a critic, he's an enemy. We got to get rid of him. He's even more dangerous because he's not a white guy. And he didn't take a DNA test that showed him to be 1/1024th. He's a real Indian. By the way, Debbie and I were at the Texas rally for Trump. I'd never been to a political rally, so I kind of wanted to see Trump, doing his thing. And Trump is very different than the man I kind of cut my teeth on in politics, which is Reagan. Trump has a way of going after his critics. The media. Reagan was above the fray, Trump is in the fray. In the rally, he referred to Maxine Waters as a very low IQ individual. But the debate is not settled. I understand that Maxine Waters is taking an IQ test. She's in the 9th percentile, but that's remarkable. That means that only 91% of Americans are smarter than her. That's it. I think she thinks it's a complete refutation of Trump's allegation that she's the dumbest politician in America. In any event, fascism. If we're looking for fascist tactics today, we find them not on the right, but on the left. Trump is being savaged on every platform every second of every day. People say, Trump's an authoritarian. Well, any real authoritarian would have shut that down. Mussolini would have sent some brown shirts to beat up the guys at CNN. How hard would that be, Jim Acosta? But Trump doesn't do that. Trump is basically a mud wrestler. And for the first time, what he's done is he's taken the left and said, all right, you want to mud wrestle? Come into the mud with the greatest mud wrestler in American history. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to draw quickly to a close. Ultimately, it seems to me the most important thing in a university is truth. Not diversity, not even liberty. It's truth itself. The reason liberty is important is it is the necessary mechanism to get to the truth. You need free and open debate to pursue the elusive quarry of truth. The beauty of living today is that we can check our facts. When I say things like, no Republican in 1860 owned a slave, all the slaves in the country were owned by Democrats, you can check. And you only need a single counterexample to make me take it back. Or if I say the racist Dixiecrats never converted, all you have to do is pull out your phone and call them up and look for yourself, and you'll see who's right. So the beauty of today is we are in a position to challenge assumptions, even though they have been somehow drummed into us from a young age. And so I want to invite you to think with an open mind. Let's have the kind of civil debate that someone tried to shut down today. There needs to be more of this in schools like Michigan State. And the only way it will happen is if you demand it. If you say, it's part of my education to have it. And because otherwise, I think part of the problem with the like-mindedness of people on the faculty and the administration is they're quite content with letting progressive historiography rule the day. And I'm not saying that the progressives are lying outright. I'm just saying that they have the human tendency to suppress facts that make their side look bad. And they have a human tendency to try to take the things that they did and pin them on the other side. And that has been happening, I think, to unfortunate effect in American politics today. Lincoln once said, "The fiery trial through which we pass will light us in honor or in dishonor down to the latest generation." And I think what he meant is that Americans go through difficult times, traumatic times, and this is one of them. We're seeing, in a sense, a secession of the American mind. We're all looking for ways to make it better. Lincoln's way of making it better was not, by the way, to bend, but to hold firm, to hold firm. And at times, Lincoln was extremely tough. At one point in the early stages of the war, it came to Lincoln's attention that when black Union soldiers were captured by the Confederacy, they were summarily shot. Not white soldiers who were normal prisoners of war, but black soldiers were such an insult to the idea of the Confederacy that they were killed. And Lincoln issued what, to my mind, is the most barbaric order to come out of the northern side, an executive order from Lincoln's desk, signed by him. For every black Union soldier executed by the Confederacy, one Confederate soldier will be shot. Now, why would a moderate man like Lincoln do something that is so severe? Well, the answer was that Lincoln realized that if he didn't do it to them, they would never stop. And that's important to realize today. If Antifa can roam the campus and intimidate speakers, if this one guy was able to stop me from speaking and all of you were sent home, if the university acquiesced in that, they would count that as a win. They would be like, that's what we got to do at every event. Remember when Condoleezza Rice was invited to be a graduation speaker at Rutgers? There was a ruckus, and Condoleezza Rice withdrew. She said, I don't want to speak if there are people who don't want me to speak. But the problem with that is it gives in. It encourages the intimidation. It rewards it. It subsidizes it. And we're at a time where we have to stand up for liberty. We have to stand up for freedom. But at the end of the day, we have to stand up for truth. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have, I believe, a setup for questions.
Yes, we'll be taking
the questions are right here.
All right, everybody, whoever wants to ask Dinesh a question, proceed to this side of the room, go across the back of the room if you're on that side, and meet my colleague over there and behind that tape line over there.
This question goes out to our fallen comrade over there. You made a claim that Mussolini's philosophy was based off of the failure of Marxism, and he said Marxism didn't work, so we need a national Marxism, sort of.
Yes.
Well, there's two problems with that claim in my eyes. One is that I'm not sure there was evidence already at that time in 1920 that Marxism had failed, because the Soviet Union basically had just become a thing, and that was sort of a new idea, and I don't know if it had time to fail yet. And the other is I've never met a socialist who thought that Marxism didn't work.
Well, the idea that Marxism had failed preceded both Mussolini and Lenin. You can look at both fascism and Soviet communism as responses to the failure of Marxism. This seems paradoxical, but let me show why it's true. Marx had insisted that as countries become rich, the contradictions of capitalism will force a clash. And that had not happened in any European country, which is where Marx thought it would happen. And in fact, it has never happened anywhere in the world. In no country have workers actually revolted against their employers and created violent revolutions. So Lenin knew that and Mussolini knew that. They both had to explain it and come up with a solution to it. So Lenin basically said, look, the reason that capitalism hasn't collapsed is because of imperialism. Essentially, the Western powers have exported the crisis of capitalism abroad, which is why revolutions can be expected not in Germany and France, but in third world countries like Russia. And so Lenin justified the Russian Revolution as a response to the failure of Marxism. In other words, that imperialism had sort of fortified capitalism and a new type of revolution was needed. So Mussolini, viewing exactly the same problem, and by the way, Mussolini and Lenin knew each other. They were mutual admirers. When Mussolini started the fascist party in Italy, he got a telegram of congratulations from Lenin. Why? Because Lenin recognized him as a fellow revolutionary on the left. So this is the part of history that progressivism has covered up. Why? Because after the war, it was really important to take the socialism out of National Socialism, to pretend like Hitler wasn't really a socialist, he just said that. But if you look at the platform of the Nazi Party, again, conveniently available on your phone, Google Nazi 25-point platform and read it. State control of the banks, state control of education, state control of healthcare, and down the list it goes. Very obvious that you're dealing with a left-wing socialist agenda that is actually not unfamiliar to us today.
First of all, thanks for taking pictures with my granddaughter. That was awesome. It's a two-part question. One is, what's next for you? I'd like to know. And also, your true take on American history. What's your opinion of it?
What's next for me is, Debbie and I are on a kind of a busy sweep before the election. We're doing a series of events. We'll settle down a little bit after that and think ahead. We're experimenting with the idea of doing some feature films, which are beyond documentaries. They're the gold standard of Hollywood. And, I mean, the big guy in Hollywood isn't Michael Moore. I mean, the big guy in Hollywood is Michael Moore, but the really big guy in Hollywood is Steven Spielberg. We're also thinking about 2020. And so I'm thinking about book ideas and a movie idea for 2020. So this is a niche I've sort of stumbled into. Most of my career, I was a scholar and speaker. I didn't do the movies, but I find that they reach an audience that the books don't reach. So I like to do the books and the films as a 1-2 punch. With regard to American history, I mean, I'm fascinated by how large areas and questions of American history that would interest an immigrant are completely ignored in progressive historiography. For example, the United States was, in the year 1800, one of the poorest countries in the world. Shocking to say, but true. And then in the course of about 75 years, the United States became the richest country in the world. It had the largest GNP. It had the largest opportunity. That's why immigrants started coming as a magnet from all over the place. They're still coming now. So to me, a question is very interesting. How does a poor country become rich? What was the key to that? And the key to that can never be simply things like oppression, because you can't get rich by oppressing people who are even poorer than you are. There has to be some formula for wealth creation. Wealth creation. A very powerful idea and a non-intuitive idea. When I was a kid, I'd go to school with marbles in my pocket, and I'd like to come home with more marbles than I went. Right? But I also realize that it's a zero-sum game. The only way for me to get more marbles is for me to get somebody else's marbles. The concept that we could somehow create new marbles, so all of us would go home with more marbles, my young brain would not get its head around that. That's wealth creation. America figured that out. So to me, the genius of America isn't just invention, it's the invention of invention. How did that occur? What's the story of that? Who are the heroes of that? You can open a history book and it doesn't tell you. So I'm interested in the ignored questions of American history that would interest, let's say, an outsider. The kind of question that would interest Tocqueville, coming from a different society and noticing, wow, there's something unique about America. Explain that. So that's where I'm going. Next question.
Hello, my question is, if Nazism and fascism in Germany was so similar to Stalinism in the Soviet Union, why did Hitler consider Stalin his greatest enemy and consider that Lebensraum to the east was the way to go and killed 80% sent 80% of his soldiers to fight the Soviets if they were basically the same ideology?
Very good question, which is, if Nazism and communism are both leftist, how come they went to war? First of all, it's important to realize that ideologies that are very close to each other frequently do go to war. The Catholics and the Protestants, the Shia and the Sunni. The Shia and the Sunni are both in the House of Islam. They actually agree on 99% of theological beliefs, but they've been fighting for centuries. Why? Competitions over territory and power and so on. Remember that Hitler was a national socialist. The reason that Hitler hated the communists was not because they were socialists. He liked that part about it. What he didn't like is that they were taking their orders from Moscow. He saw them as traitors to Germany. So Hitler's priority was socialism in Germany. Now remember that Hitler, who went to war with Stalin, was allied with Stalin. So on the foreign policy domain, Hitler was perfectly happy to sign the Hitler-Stalin Pact and then violate it for reasons of national interest. So the bottom line of it is the fact that Germany and the Soviet Union went to war in no way refutes the idea that progressivism, communism, and fascism were all three sister movements that developed in Germany, in Italy, in America, and in Russia, all in response to the crisis of Marxism. Okay.
Thank you for coming out to speak. So I'm an MSU student, and as you might expect, going throughout the years of my education, looking at different textbooks, there have been different degrees of, I guess, invasion by what I could call leftist ideology. And I'm in a hard science, I'm in a neuroscience. So as I've come close to the edge of this harder science, it's still kind of creeping up in there. I'm wondering, do you feel as though with how much we're ensconced in leftist ideology in academia, that change is more likely to come from within or without at this point?
I agree with Thomas Kuhn's idea that change, when one ideology is embedded, change does not generally come by the people who espouse that ideology seeing the light, admitting their errors, and backing down. What really happens is that there is an institutional shift, or a younger generation comes up that does not accept this ideology, and so there's a displacement of the powers that be by a new set of powers with a different set of assumptions, so I'm betting more on that.
Oh, this is a little off topic, but you touched on Antifa and groups like that here in the United States. What's your, I guess, your input on the militias here in the United States and the role we should play?
I can't say I know a lot about the militia movement. I actually, years ago, Megyn Kelly asked me to go to the Bundy Ranch when there was the showdown with Clive and Bundy and a bunch of guys. I went not as a participant, but as an observer, and it was my first up-close look at a phenomenon that was very creepy, which is to say, an attempt to amass vast federal force, and then a bunch of militia guys with a lot of weaponry determined to resist it. And I saw this as having the potential of Waco times 10, a massive showdown between the US government and its own citizens. So that scared me. It scared me in the sense that the United States government, of course, has almost infinite firepower, as we all know. And we live at a time when that firepower is mobilized against American citizens. You'll be very surprised. You don't know it when it doesn't happen to you. But if your uncle gets arrested, and he could be a doctor who's arrested for administering, let's just say, illegal pain medicine, and the case is very debatable because doctors administer pain medicine all the time, but someone makes an indictment, and you expect it to be two FBI guys with a folder, and instead, your uncle goes to a restaurant, and he's surrounded by police cars, and there's a helicopter overhead, and there are automatic weapons pointed at him, and this is the America we live in now. It's happening here, and you don't know it if it doesn't happen to you. But once it happens to you, you're not the same. It happened to me in a very small way. I'm not the same. And so our patriotism now has to be grounded in a recognition that there are very bad things happening in America, and we do need to be very vigilant about them. So no comment on the militias, but I will say that there are times when I feel like this America that we love is on a powder keg, and we've got to find a way to demilitarize, if I can use that term. But the demilitarize is not to take away all our guns so that we are sitting ducks, but rather to figure out a way that the government treats citizens fairly.
All right, bear with me here for a second. I got a little bit of context for my question, but you just painted yourself earlier as the victim of your felony, even though you knowingly made donations under the names of people that were not you. You've called Obama a boy out of the ghetto for using a selfie stick in the Oval Office. And this past week, you spread misinformation about the bombs that were mailed, even while people like Ben Shapiro said people spreading those conspiracy theories were deranged. So I'm wondering why, unlike Shapiro, you believe you even deserve a morsel of credibility.
Sure. Well, one of the things you have to realize in the world of social media is that we always start with limited information, right? There's these packages, they show up, and all we see are social media images of the packages. And so the first thing that people notice, not me, others on social media, is, wait a minute, this guy, homeless, living out of his van, somehow orchestrated packages to be delivered to all these important people to arrive on exactly the same day, and the images of them showed stamps on the package but no post office postmark on those stamps. And so people like me, I didn't even say who did it, I just raised questions. I'm like, what's going on here? Hey, I noticed that there isn't a stamp. Now, this is, you can call it amateur sleuthing, but it's not conspiracy theories. It is actually citizens trying to figure out what the hell is going on in our country. So this is not a sign of conspiracy mongering. Now, if it turns out that we're wrong, and the guy, let's just say, took his package, put stamps, and put that in a bigger package, which he then mailed, then we get it. That information comes out, we recognize it. So, as with the Kavanaugh hearings and all these things, we get snapshots of what is going on, and it's a moving picture, and we're trying to make a sense of the picture as it moves. It is a fallacy of logic to use the retroactive knowledge that we have at the end of the day to say, hey, you were wrong, so you're a conspiracy theorist. I didn't have that information at the time. So in other words, you can only judge people by the judgments they make in the moving current of events. Now, let's talk about the other things that you talked about. What were your other examples? You gave...
when you lied about being the victim.
I lied about, yeah.
You said you accidentally gave too much when you put it under the name of other people. That was
No, I'll tell you what happened. I mean, I'll describe exactly what happened since you raised the issue. My college friend Wendy Long was running for the Senate, and she asked me to help her. I told her not to run. I said, you're an unknown, you don't have any money, but she was running against a fellow Dartmouth grad, Christian Gillibrand, who's the sitting senator from New York. I said, but if you run, I'll try to help you. And so she decided to run. I wrote her a check for $10,000, and that's the limit, and I knew it. So I wrote her a check for the full amount. Then I released my Obama movie, and I'm in Dallas promoting it, and I'm at a premiere here, and I'm doing this, and I'm on the media there. And Wendy was calling me every day saying, I'm having an event in Scarsdale. Can you come and speak? I have a bunch of Indian doctors. I want to try to get some money out of them. You know, you're Indian, they're Indian. Can you come have dinner? I was like, no, I'm in San Diego. So I felt bad that I couldn't help her. I knew I'd reached the limit. So I asked two of my friends, I said, do you like Wendy Long? Give her $10,000 and I'll reimburse you. So that was my offense. I reimbursed two of my friends 10 grand. That's where the $20,000 came from. That's what I meant when I said I gave out of excessive zeal. I had no idea this was a felony. I had no idea the government would come after me in this way. Here's the key to my case. If you can find a single American who was locked up for 8 months for doing what I did, I will immediately accept error and back down. But no such case exists. I'm sorry?
Did you not see the inside of a prison?
I was in what's called a federal confinement center behind bars with 150 hardened felons sleeping in a dormitory on bunk beds. And so you can make of that what you will. All I'm saying is that hasn't happened to anyone else. In fact, I don't know anyone who was even indicted, let alone prosecuted for doing what I did. And what I did happens all the time in law firms where partners ask guys to give. It's a very common offense. It's never prosecuted. So justice isn't just a matter of did you do it. It's also a matter of the proportionality of the penalty to the offense and whether other people got the same crime. Think of it. If you're speeding, you broke the law, right? And if you got 3 years in prison and you said, that's unfair, I couldn't say to you, but you admitted it, you broke the law. Yes, you broke the law, but no one who speeds gets that. The penalty is not proportionate to the offense. That's what I'm trying to say. Not that I should have gotten off scot-free, not at all.
Dinesh, thank you for coming. Big fan, been following your career since King's College. Love your books, love your movies. Hope you would consider signing one or two if that's not inappropriate. My question specifically is that with recent comments by prominent Republicans like Paul Ryan, by predictions about Supreme Court cases that are yet to be even agreed to, much less heard, I wondered what your opinion was of the subject to the jurisdiction of language of the 14th Amendment and what, if any, prediction you had for the outcome of that case.
By way of context, we're talking about the birthright issue, whether someone born in the United States automatically becomes a U.S. citizen. The 14th Amendment does use that language, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. I interpret it to mean this, that if you have two legal residents of America, they don't even have to be citizens. They could be green card holders. I was a green card holder for 5 years before I became a naturalized U.S. citizen. And I take Trump to be saying that if two green card holders had a child in America, that child would be an American citizen. But if you had two people come unlawfully to this country and have a child here, in that sense, they are outside the jurisdiction of the United States, then no, based upon that plain language of the 14th Amendment, they would not. So this issue has never been adjudicated by the Supreme Court. So what I find it funny is to have people like Caitlin Collins on CNN act as if this is a settled constitutional issue when she's actually giving you her interpretation of it, and all Trump is saying is, let the court figure it out.
Failure or success if it were adjudicated by the Supreme Court?
I chuckle at your question because, ironically, our court has now become a political organ. By the way, the left knows this, and they've always known it. When the left appoints people to the court, they are looking for good Democrats. They're looking for people whose votes they can count on with Euclidean certainty. It's only Republicans who say things like, we need to find someone who has a deep love of learning. We need to find somebody who's going to excavate the original meaning of the people who wrote the Constitution. What I'm getting at is that for them it's political. And I think that Republicans are waking up to the fact that a lot of issues that should be adjudicated democratically have now been punted to the court. So if it's going to be political, let's make it political. And right now it's probably a 5-4 majority. If Republicans do well in the midterms, there's a good chance it'll be 6-3. If Trump is elected, 7-2. And then you won't have to ask questions like this one.
Thanks for coming. I sure appreciate it. I've followed you for years. I want to just preface a little to say I'm 62, and in the era when I was born, Democrats and Republicans disagreed on policy, but they tended to read newspapers. They didn't expect to have news encapsulated in 30 seconds. How do we deal with, this is my main question, when we see mobs rising, we don't see intellectual debate, frankly, on either side too often. We see that talk radio works for Republicans and conservatives. It always fails with the liberals. And I conceive that it seems that we're on two different sides, emotional on the liberal side and hopefully remaining intellectual on the conservative side. Given that that's a juxtaposition that's never going to marry itself, we don't win when we give them intellectual arguments like this gentleman. He didn't want to hear what you had to say. He wouldn't give you 10 seconds. And he just wanted to emote. So how do we hope to win, where I'm glad to see so many young people here today, but as we look at the general tone, I don't see the majority of young people becoming more intellectually oriented. I see the emotional side winning. How do we get past that? When we make an educational question and they don't care, and they make an emotional question, which frankly has nothing to do with the right or wrong answer, how do we get past that?
In my view, there are two things going on here that are separate, but they're linked. The first one is that in American politics in the 80s, as I remember it, Americans in general agreed on goals, but disagreed on means. When you agree on a goal, but disagree on the means, you can actually find common ground. Because you would say something like, we want America to be great. We want America to be strong. We want America to be rich. We want there to be a huge pie. We want America to be an example for the world. Now, we have disagreements. How should we carve up the pie? Should we intervene abroad unilaterally, or should we always make sure our allies go along with us? These were the kind of debates that would go on between, say, Reagan and Tip O'Neill. But the idea of bashing the country, or dissing the flag, kneeling for the anthem, the whole notion that American history is one succession of uninterrupted crimes created and visited upon people, this is a different thing. Now there's a breakdown of agreement on goals, because you have a group of people who say, what you could call traditional America, we actually see that as the enemy. We want to take that down. And then the other group goes, the hell you will. And so suddenly you now have a fight. That's point number one. The second point is that the reason for the breakdown of debate is because the left, which had a dominant position in the past, moved to an almost monopoly position and had no interest in hearing the other side. It's not that they're emotional and we're intellectual. Plenty of intellectuals on their side. There's a very smart historian named Kevin Cruz at Princeton. I've repeatedly told him, I'd like to debate you. We'll debate on your home campus in front of your students. You will have all the natural advantage of being on home ground. He won't do it. Why not? Because to him, he doesn't need to. He has those guys where he wants them. They're eating out of his hand. Why would he run the risk that I would come in and convince even 10%, let alone 50% of his students, that their professor doesn't know what he's talking about? He can't take that risk, so he won't do it. So it's not that he's not an intellectual. He's an intellectual with a monopoly podium, and he's determined to hold on to that power and not let me into the room unless and somehow I break in. And so it's going to be up to conservative students at Princeton to bring me to that campus, and that's when I can call him out, but I still can't do it in his classroom. He won't have it. Okay, next question.
Hello, thank you for coming.
My question is, well, you said quite correctly, I think, that a key difference between President Reagan and President Trump was that President Reagan went above the fray, whereas President Trump goes into the fray like a mud wrestler, like you said. So my question is, as a voice of support for both presidents, how do you reconcile that difference in strategy, and do you think one is more correct?
That's a very good question, and my answer is this, that I think that Reagan would be a fish out of water if he lived today. The waters are just too roiled for Reagan conservatism. One reason in my movie poster I somewhat audaciously juxtapose the images of Trump and Lincoln is that the one guy who, if he was alive today, would fully grasp the situation and not be flustered by it is Lincoln. Why? Because the waters were even more roiled in 1860. When people came up to Lincoln and said of Grant, he's a bum. He bankrupted his father's store. He's a womanizer. He's an alcoholic. Lincoln's only response was, but can he fight? But can he fight? Because the country is in a civil war, and Lincoln's argument was, we'll take up these other issues after the war is over. Now, Republicans have tried to nominate one Boy Scout after another. McCain, Romney, and they've noticed that these unimpeachable guys, Kavanaugh fits this category, by the way, because people kept saying in the hearings, you know, he said, she said. No, it's not he said, she said. It's he said, she said when a cop goes to a domestic violence complaint and you don't know anything about the two people and he said, she said. But if somebody accuses Albert Einstein of faking his equations, it's not he said, she said. Einstein is a Nobel laureate. He's been in public life. Innumerable people testify not only to his intellectual competence, but to his personal rectitude. And then some person shows out of nowhere, scrubs their social media, and he said, she said. You're not talking about an equal playing field here. Credibility doesn't equally attach to the accuser and the accused under that circumstance. So Republicans have said, you know, we try to put up these guys like Romney who have these squeaky clean resumes, and the left beats them to a pulp. You know, you're a rapacious, greedy swindler. How did you get $200 million? And here's poor Romney, you know, trying to explain. But notice that no one ever does this to Trump. Hey, how did you get $1 billion? You can't say that to Trump because he'll sit you down and explain why he has a lot more than $1 billion. That's Trump. In my opinion, it's not Trump who created the division created him. He's a response to it.
All right, folks, this will be our last question.
You hold it. Hi, Dinesh. I got involved in education advocacy 18 years ago when I noticed my children were getting indoctrinated in the public schools. They're both students at U of M now, and I have a front row seat at way worse indoctrination than I ever thought I would see. I'm currently running for State Board of Education to try to fight that and also to improve academics. Could you please tell me your opinion as to why Republicans don't stand up for the leftist indoctrination happening in our schools when we're paying for it?
Oh, good question.
I think the problem is that universities and to some degree schools are set up in such a way that there is very little true accountability. If you take a professor, not at a state college or at a private school, it makes no difference. Whether it's Michigan State or whether it's Tulane University, this professor is, you may say, grazing fat and happy without anyone to be able to look over his or her shoulder except his or her peers. The administration doesn't have any real authority. The parents have none. The taxpayer authority is so indirect it has no real power. The trustees are a virtual rubber stamp and have no actual intellectual oversight. So you have a very peculiar structure that if it goes awry, now it doesn't always go awry, and when it's functioning fine, this kind of autonomy is all right. I don't even think there's intellectual freedom of a faculty member to speak. I'm in favor of that. My problem is that very often now what you have is the herd of independent thinkers syndrome, in which a faculty department is all echoing each other. Now, there are great debates going on in the country, but those are not being reflected in the economics department here at all, because these guys all think alike. And they're going to make sure that they hire people who think exactly like them. And if there are young academics who are trying to work on a thesis and get tenure that think differently, they will make sure that guy's career is ruined. So this to me is the intellectual thuggery that has actually also become a staple part of our educational system. So the disappearance of public debate, even CNN, remember just a couple of decades ago, CNN used to have a show called Crossfire, in which they would have Michael Kinsley on the left, Pat Buchanan on the right. Or Bill Buckley used to have Firing Line. I participated in a couple of Firing Line debates. And even though the intellectual quality of those varied, it gave you the chance to watch and go, wow, here's what this guy thinks, here's what that guy thinks. I can now set the two side by side and make up my own mind. Today, it's more like two ships passing by. You feel like you're talking to really two different universes altogether. Now again, the left created that and the right responded to it. In other words, CNN canceled Crossfire, and there was no conservative point of view on CNN or ABC or NBC or CBS, and so conservatives created talk radio. That's what created Rush Limbaugh. Roger Ailes, who started the Fox News channel, basically said, look, if we're right, we conservatives are right that half the country is not being served by mainstream media, then creating right-wing media should have a big market. And he was right. So he created, if you will, the right's answer to MSNBC and CNN, Fox News Channel, and this created this kind of separation that, is it unhealthy on the balance? Yes, because it would be really good to have these points of view clash. But look, I make a movie, I make all these extraordinary claims, factual claims. If I were wrong, Rachel Maddow, a smart person, could have me on her show, go, Dinesh, you said that in 1860 no Republican owned a slave. I have in my hands the names of 3 Republicans who owned slaves. She'll never do that because she doesn't. And it's too dangerous for her to put me on because she bloviates about fascism every day. And if she puts me on, in 90 seconds, it will go to the nub of the issue, which is things like, name one thing that Trump has done that actually would legitimately be called fascist. And she wouldn't be able to do it. And so then the show would unravel. And so they know this. They all know this. And so, and it's true on the conservative side too. It's one-sided rhetoric being blasted, and it's very unhealthy. So do we want to get back to a better America in which we have this kind of debate? Yes. It's going to take creativity for that to happen. It's not happening in the structures we have now. So here we are on campus. I've tried to introduce a little whiff of what that debate might sound like here. And it's kind of a pity that that young fellow was sort of escorted out of the room, because it actually would have been healthy for him to speak his mind, to have him understand a little better how an immigrant like me thinks the way I do. I would like to understand better how someone who is living in the abundance of America and enjoying the fruits of a way of life that he takes for granted, that's so scarce in the rest of the world, nevertheless feels this kind of, feels that they have to act in this kind of adolescent and almost barbaric way. What causes that? What threat do I pose to him? What am I saying that is so out of bounds that he literally can't stand it and can only respond with insults and epithets? Very diseased body politic that we have now. So